Good evening, everyone. My name is Ware Harmon, and I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of the staff here, as well as our friends at Third Place Books, it's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's discussion with Claudia Goldin and Kiana Scott. As we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. We are very glad you've joined us for tonight's virtual event. I make the distinction since I hope you've gotten the word by now that we're also presenting live events in our building as well as hybrid events, which are, well, they're probably exactly what you think they are. At any rate, we're grateful when you're with us, no matter where you are, if you get my meaning. Tonight's presentation will run around 60 minutes, including Q&A. To streamline our audience experiences, we've changed the Q&A platform for our events. So to submit your question, please enter meet.ps/Goldin or scan the QR code right now on the screen with your smartphone. We'll drop this link in the chat. I did that little skeptical pivot because I personally can't stand that scanning thing. But at any rate, you'll do what you're going to do to find your way to the ability to pose a question, because I'm sure you will have some after tonight's conversation. The link will be in the chat, and we'll remind you later exactly how you can join the Q&A, be a part of the conversation. We can't guarantee we'll be able to address every question, but we'll try to get to as many as we can. And for those of you who want to view the program with closed captions, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Town Hall's adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming events include Paige Harden on why DNA matters for social equality, Michelle Miller-Fisher and Amber Winnick on objects designed for the world of motherhood, Obama advisor Beth Simone Novick with practical ways to recenter government around solving public problems, as well as upcoming appearances by Susan Orlean and soon to be announced Neil Stevenson. Visit our website to join our email list and get the latest updates as more programs are added throughout the season. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Civics series is supported by the Real Networks Foundation, the True Brown Foundation, and the Wincoat Foundation Northwest. But as you likely know by now, certainly if you're a member, Town Hall is underneath it all a member-supported organization, and I want to thank all of our members tuning in tonight. If you share Town Hall's vision of a community strengthened by inquiries into politics, science, and culture, we hope you'll consider supporting us with a donation or by becoming a member yourself. Last, I know you'll want to dig in deeper on tonight's topic by purchasing your own copy of Claudia Goldin's book, so please use the link in the chat below to pick up your copy through Third Place Books. And with that, an historian and an economist best known for her work on women in the US economy, Claudia Goldin is the Henry Lee Professor of Economics at Harvard University. The first tenured woman in Harvard's economics department, Goldin's research covers a wide range of topics, including the female labor force, the gender gap in earnings, income inequality, and well beyond. Dr. Goldin is also co-director of the National Bureau of Economic Research's Gender in the Economy Study Group and was previously director of the NBER's Development of the American Economy program from 1989 to 2017. Most of her research interprets the present through the lens of the past and explores the origins of current issues of concern. Her books include 1990's Understanding the Gender Gap, 1998's The Defining Moment, The Race Between Education and Technology from 2008, and 2018's Women Working Longer. Kiana Scott leads fundraising and communications for CareerWorks, a workforce development nonprofit. Kiana received her PhD in political communication, focusing on gender and American politics from the University of Washington, and she serves as vice president of the Henry M. Jackson Foundation, a board member of the National Women's Political Caucus of Washington, which helps women win elected office. Goldin's latest book, I should say Claudia's latest book, Career and Family, Women's Century-Long Journey Toward Equity, is the subject of their discussion tonight. Please join me in welcoming Claudia Goldin. We'll offer a brief introduction to her book before she in turn will welcome Kiana Scott to the conversation. In the meantime, Claudia Goldin.
Well, thanks very much. Prior to March of 2020, in a time that I'm going to call BCE, which means before the COVID era, the reasons that women were being held back from achieving career and family became clearer, and clouds parted, and it allowed us to see what was blocking their way. Then in March of 2020, as we descended into what I'm going to call the DC era during COVID, rather than altering that realization, the pandemic brought actually further clarity to it. And as we moved into a hybrid era in which we live now, that I'm going to call AC/DC, meaning after COVID, but also during COVID, we have amazingly enough, and I think really surprisingly, embraced as a nation the possibility of real change in caregiving and also in the workplace. My book takes you on that journey of discovery and traverses 120 years from a time when college graduate women were able to have either family or a career or a job, to now when many anticipate having both a family and a career. But today, more women than men are graduating college, and about the same fractions, men and women are achieving advanced and professional degrees. But while there is great similarity in ambitions, there is less in eventual achievement. And the reason concerns the concept of greedy work and the relationship between gender equality and couple equity. Or shall I say also between gender inequality and couple inequity. These are two sides of the same issue. Here are two sides of the same coin. And they are the two sides for heterosexual couples. For same-sex couples, there can be couple inequity, and there often is, just as there is for heterosexual couples, but that does not necessarily increase gender inequality. When heterosexual couples give up couple equity, they increase gender inequality. And our conversation today is going to explain precisely why that occurs and what might be done about it. A few clarifications. First, my work concerns college graduate women because they have had the greatest opportunity to achieve career, even when their numbers were low. And the second clarification is that a career is different from a job. I mean it to be something different. A career is achieved over time. It comes from the Latin to mean to run a race. Think chariot, think carriage. A job, on the other hand, is a spot position to earn a living, to make income. The groups of college graduate women that we're going to talk about form a succession of 5 generations, 5 groups, each sort of metaphorically passing a baton from one to the next, the baton having warnings, having advice. The 120-year transition from career or family to career and family is bookended here with women who served in Congress, beginning with Jeannette Rankin, the first woman elected to federal office. She was typical of the career portion of her group. She had no children, she'd never married, but she had one heck of an amazing career. And on the other side is Tammy Duckworth, the first senator to have a baby while holding office, and the first to bring a baby into an active session of Congress, although most people would say there have always been babies in Congress. And Betty Friedan, looking very coquettish, is in the middle here. Group 5 ends with women now in their 40s. And the reason I do that is because I want to know everything that they've done in terms of marriage and children. And generally, I can measure most of that by the time they're in their 40s. But I don't mean to say that women in their 20s and 30s are left out. Group 5 still continues. So let's explore all of their journeys to understand why we are not yet there. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Golden, so nice to see you. And we spoke earlier and you asked me to call you Claudia, which I'm delighted to do. But I do want to acknowledge your vast work and experience. I also wish that we could have you join us in person. I know you're speaking to us from your office, one of your offices at Harvard University, but you are a lover of the Pacific Northwest. So
Absolutely.
Have to have you back out here at some point in the future. Thank you so much. It's really it's an honor to speak with you, and it's an honor to speak with you at Town Hall, an organization that does so much for our community and manages to bring together in the space of 1 week this conversation, a conversation about lizards and squid, conversation about transportation and cello performances. So such a delight. You started by sharing a definition, the definition that you're using for this work about career. And I'm going to ask you to continue with defining some of the terms that you're using. What does family mean specifically for this work?
So in this work, family just means a child, adopted, birth, so therefore I don't have children. I have a dog. The dog is part of my family, but not as I'm defining it. And it's also the case that to have a family in the work that I'm doing, in the measures that I've made, it does not require that there be a husband present or a spouse present.
And what about the concept of greedy work that you introduced?
Right. So greedy work means here an employee who's willing to work lots of hours, maybe not just the number of hours, but when in the evenings, the weekends, on vacation, the person who's on call at the office. And that's the person who will get bigger rewards. And so when these rewards are sort of disproportionate to the time that's put in, and that means that if you double the number of hours, you more than double the amount this person earns, that is the definition here of greedy work. But it's even bigger than that, in the sense that it may not be, as I said, the number of hours, it may be which hours. And the relationship can be sort of more dynamic, in the sense that there are lots of positions that are up or out positions. So you put in a lot of time, and when you're young and you make partner, you make tenure, you get that first promotion. So that's the concept of greedy work, and the impact that it has on families is very great. And that's really the basis of much of the argument in the second part of the book. Yeah.
And Claudia, what do you mean by couple equity? Can you speak to that?
Right. So if an individual has children, if a couple has children, or some other family responsibilities, that person, it has to be, in some sense, at call at home. So the person, if something happens to the child and the nurse calls up the family, someone has to be on call at home. And of course, that's the case even if the person has a job. And the on-call at-home person will take a position that has greater flexibility, that enables that. If there's a position that requires that the person travel over the Pacific every other week, and we know there used to be positions like that, that would not be a highly flexible position. So someone has to take the more flexible, less demanding position, and in consequence, that position pays less, even on an hourly basis. And it's when one person in the couple does that and the other one doesn't, is when we have an absence of couple equity. Having 50-50-ness in a couple doesn't mean that each of you does the same thing at every moment in time, but it means that one person isn't giving up that career job, and the other person has a very good job, but it may be a job that just enables more flexibility. And as we know, women are generally the ones who are the on-call at-home parent. And so the flip side of couple inequity is then gender inequality. So, so all couples with children, whether they be heterosexual couples or same-sex couples, encounter sort of a strong pull towards that type of, let's call it specialization. And they often jettison couple equity because it's expensive, so, and it just depends upon how expensive it is. So if you're two lawyers and one lawyer could earn a very large amount, but has to work long hours, or if it's a consultant and they have to travel every other weekend, or an accountant, or many other different occupations, then and another job that has more flexibility, that doesn't have these requirements, is much lower, let's say 20,000 a year lower, then that is the amount that they would have to pay to have couple equity. Both of them could take the flexible job, but they would just leave a certain amount of money on the table. So that's the relationship between couple equity and gender inequality.
And can you speak specifically about the gender earning gap? What is that? Why do we care?
So we care because we, in some sense, want there to be equality. We want there to be equality of opportunity. So there are lots of possible reasons for, we know that there's a gender gap in terms of earnings.
Sadly, we do.
That we certainly know. And there are many different ways of measuring it. So some of the reasons that, that we stand up for as being wrongs are sexual harassment, bias in terms of hiring or promotions, what we think of as real discrimination or wrongs. And that is certainly responsible for some part, but the vast amount of these differences are due to the factors that I've just set forth, that that by and large, and we see in what we call event studies, that if there are couples and there are children, that after the children are born or arrive, that the differences in earnings between men and women, if this is a heterosexual couple, increase by quite a lot. So the fact that there's a set of reasons for gender imbalances in earnings that we point to, such as bias and discrimination, we point to them because we feel that there's something can be done about them. Whereas if we got rid of all of those, and I hope one day we will get rid of all of those, we will still be left with differences in earnings due to these other set of factors.
And Claudia, is that true historically as well? Can you speak about the longitudinal work that you've done as you've traced these different cohorts of women starting in the late 1800s up until now, essentially, and what you've unpacked? What's changed? What hasn't changed?
Right. So in the past, if we look through these groups, we see barriers that are greater than anything that we can imagine today. So up until the 1940s, in many school districts in the US, there were what were called marriage bars. So if you were married, you couldn't get a job as a teacher in many school districts. If you were a teacher and you got married, they were called, you could be summarily fired. And these then, during the Great Depression in the 1930s, these also spread to clerical employments as well. And these barriers, these obvious barriers to women's employment in good jobs began to decline over time. And so if we look back to the groups, group 1 and group 2 and group, then beginning with group 3, they began to these real barriers began to crumble. But if we go back to group 1 and 2, we see that women had career or family because there were real barriers in terms of laws and regulations of school districts, laws and regulations. They were anti-nepotism rules, so that if you were a professor and you were married to another professor, you couldn't get a job in the same place. And these sort of began to crumble in the 1940s and the 1950s. But lots of other, I think one by one, many of these barriers began to crumble. But in some sense, this is why I began with the clouds parted, and what has really been going on has become clearer.
And can you speak about your decision to dive into this historic work? What has that approach brought to your research? What has that approach really clarified about what we're experiencing today?
Right. So, so this is sort of in some sense, a very big question, but my research has been in 2 parts. And so I've been an economic historian for a very, very long time. And I've researched many different aspects of the economy and of women in the economy. And my first book, called Understanding the Gender Gap, was oddly not that much about earnings differences. It was about differences in employment. And, it's why was it that women, let's say in the 19th century, were perhaps 10% of the labor force, and over time they became half of the labor force? And why is it the case that that happens in just about every country that is developed? And so my early work was really about trying to understand the evolution of women's employment. But I also became interested in differences in earnings. And in many ways, this book sort of combines the 2. It puts together the evolution of the groups of women who are trying to put together career and family, and beginning with group 1, who has career or family. And that group, 50% of them never had children, and 30% of them never married. So they really just had one or the other. And then we move into let's say the third group, which is a group that graduated college from the late 40s to the mid 60s. These are the mothers of the baby boom. These are the people that Betty Friedan was writing about. And in many ways, they were not retrograde. They were not sort of backward. They were pushing forward. They were individuals who were enabled to have first a family and then a job and possibly even a bit of a career. And remember that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is really part of that group. So, and what's fascinating about the life of Ruth and Marty was that she, in many ways, oddly, was almost typical of her generation, in that she sort of stepped back a bit when she and Marty were here at Harvard, and then he left and went to New York. She left. She went and transferred to Columbia. And when his job became very demanding and they had 2 children, she, for a short time, stayed with the kids, and his career as a tax lawyer began to take off. And then of course, as we know, things changed. So, and then when we fast forward from group 3 to group 5, and so group 3 putting family first and then having a job or a career, as Ruth Bader Ginsburg certainly did. Then we move into generations that were enabled because they had a birth control pill to not tie the knot early, but to delay marriage, to delay children, and to invest in their career. And this history then leads us to ask the question, so then what happened? Why, if you have if you invest in your career and then you're also enabled to have a family, why can't you have career and family? And part of it has to do with this issue of greedy work.
One of the concepts, one of the themes rather, that you visit a couple of different times throughout this is the challenge of time constraints, particularly for women who have a couple of different clocks going at the same time. Can you speak to the structure of work and how it intersects with the time constraints that you identify?
Sure. So, but everything sort of depends upon the type of work that someone is doing. And so for example, a lawyer, we know that, lawyers who are in big ticket law firms make a tremendously larger amount per hour than in the boutique law firm. They work more hours, and they, in many ways, consider themselves to have a rather unique value. Now, there are occupations that are very different. So pharmacy, for example, now is a very different occupation, and it changed over time. So there was a time when pharmacy was an occupation which women earned a lot less than men. And the reason was that the pharmacist was generally a man who owned his own business. And so go back to about 1970, most pharmacists worked in owner-operated businesses, and there are still many that exist today. And that pharmacist might hire another pharmacist as an assistant, often a woman, and that pharmacist would not have as many of the demands, the time demands that are required of someone who owns their own business. But then many changes occurred that were rather organic, that were not due to the fact that women wanted to have more flexible work. And so that was the rise of the corporate model associated with CVS and Walgreens and Rite Aid. And pharmacists became better substitutes for each other through the standardization of drugs and the use of elaborate information technologies. And they no longer receive the financial rewards or have the time demands of ownership. And the gender earnings gap for hourly earnings in pharmacy is among the lowest in the high-paying occupations, even though a substantial fraction of female pharmacists work part-time, at least at some point in their careers. And pharmacy is, I think that one of the interesting things about COVID, the era of COVID, is that we suddenly realized that we are very dependent on our pharmacists. We suddenly realized that in Walgreens and CVS and Rite Aid, there are amazing professionals who work there who are in many ways our first line of defense against disease. Now, it's the case that in some occupations, these changes didn't come about organically. They came about because individuals realized that they wanted more flexibility. And some of these occupations are in health. They're, for example, pediatricians realized, well, I want to spend more time with my kids, not just with your sick kids. And they formed groups. And these groups of pediatricians meant that they would have a member of their team who could take over for them. And the same is true in veterinary medicine. And the same is true in a bunch of other occupations in which individuals said, I would like more flexibility. And it's jobs like that that bring down the price of flexibility. So that's really, in some sense, there are jobs that in which individuals are, work very, very long hours, and there are very few substitutes for them. And then there are positions in which it's pretty clear that firms and institutions realize that having at least one or two substitutes for workers, having some redundancy in organizations is good for the workers.
So there really does need to be a fundamental shift in how work is structured to continue to move us down the path we're on. Is that accurate?
I think it is. And I think that one of the amazing silver linings to our year of exile is that we have learned how to sort of reduce the price of flexibility. And I'll give you a very good example. So in many occupations, in many firms, travel was extremely important. And so, in fact, many occupations, many large firms, Deloitte, for example, decided that they would have limits on the amount of travel that their employees would have to do. But even saying, well, you don't have to travel except twice a month may still be too much for a parent who has young children. But if it's the case that we have learned now that you could do a deal in Japan without being there to do the handshake in person, and you could sign a contract in Beijing without actually being there, that you could somehow develop trust between client and the professionals, then we have brought down the price of flexibility. And it certainly looks like we have done that. Now, that said, ask anyone who's listening in right now, ask, just about anyone who works at a university or a large firm, or state government, have you figured out what your workers are going to be doing? Who's going to be working at home? Who's going to be coming in? How much inefficient it's going to be if everyone is at home? How much inefficient would be if everyone came in? I don't think that anyone has the answer yet.
Claudia, you wrote this book during the pandemic, and I mean, as you just said, we've seen this shift and reshape so much of how we think about work. But how did it shape your thinking as you wrote this book? You've studied parts of these subjects for years and decades. What brought it all together right now for you?
So the book was just about finished in March of 2020, certainly not completely finished in March of 2020, thank goodness. I cannot imagine what I would be saying now to myself if I finished the book before March of 2020. However, even though the book was begun long before the pandemic, it really took on new urgency with the lockdown. Everything that I had been saying about the reasons for the remaining differences between men and women in their earnings and their promotions and their ability to have career, everything that I was saying became clearer during the pandemic. That's what I meant by at the beginning, that even with the pandemic, suddenly things that were clear actually became even clearer. When schools closed and burdens increased for all parents, and fortunate workers could shelter at home and could retain their jobs, the pandemic really magnified the factors that I raised in the book: the importance of flexible work, the career cost of children more to women than to men, and the cost to women of couple inequity regarding unequal division of work and family.
Claudia, I have one final question for you, and then I'd love to open it up to questions from the audience. So much of what we hear in society right now is that women, specifically the women who are the subject of this work, college educated, interested in careers, engaged in careers, so much of what we should be doing is individual action, leaning in, negotiating, proactively asking for a raise. All of that's well and good, but what I want to know is, where are the men? What do we need them to be doing? Can you talk about the role that they play, and how do we recreate a bunch of Martys?
That's right. And Marty is Marty Ginsburg, of course. Yeah. So when I first came to Harvard and I decided to teach a different course than I had taught before, I began a course on women, work, and family. And I went around the room. It was a very, very small class. And I asked my students what they wanted. And one of the students in the class, this is why I love my students so much, is she came out with a statement that I think that if I had thought hard and hard, I probably would not have been able to say it as beautifully. She said, "I want a spouse who wants what I want." And in some sense, what she was saying was, you can learn to negotiate with your boss, with your manager, with your supervisor. You could learn to walk into HR and say, "This is what I deserve." But damn it, do it first with the person you're going to share a family with, just to make clear that that person wants what you want. And I somehow get a sense that, and maybe a sense that, because I live, as many of us do, in our own little bubble, and that college educated men now, and I would love to hear from people in the audience who are younger than I, that college graduate men find, maybe even all men, find having a spouse, a woman who is also successful and happy and pleased and able to carry on wonderfully interesting discussions, that's a real plus. And I think of it as, if I can be blunt, the new trophy wife. And so if the new trophy wife is more like Kiana, then we also will have solved the problem. And so perhaps the younger generation of men, maybe if in 10, 15 years, I go and I add group 5+, I'll realize that they're really a different group, and that they're a different group, not because of the women, but because of the men.
I'm going to turn to a question from the audience. Someone asks, would you say that you still see work that is considered women's work? And if so, how do you see those stereotypes changing?
Good question. So, there are fundamentals, and then there are sort of stereotypes. So let me deal more with fundamentals. So in what I've been saying, the type of work that if you have a couple who have children and one of them has to be sort of on call at home, that person could still have a job. But the type of job may be a job that requires more flexibility. And if disproportionately women take it, it's going to be thought to be more of a woman's job. Now, that said, it's also the case that there are certain jobs that even by the very name become women's work. And so nurses, it's a very interesting point that in many parts of the country, to be a nurse requires an RN, which is a college degree, no longer less than that, and that many nurses go further than that and in fact earn a substantial amount and are highly respected and can prescribe drugs. But it's also the case, interestingly, that the word nurse means a woman's job. And so being a physician assistant, which is in many states has the same level of responsibility and equivalent salaries to the nurses with advanced degrees, is more a male job relative to nurses, which is more a female job. So in that sense, there are still some, quote, stereotypically female jobs, even with advanced degrees and college degrees and professional degrees.
Someone else asks, do you think that women who work only in the home should be paid an income?
It's a very tricky question. And I never like to think that what I think matters because, because it doesn't really matter, but because one might say, I think that it would be good if everyone received a level of income that was gave them a decent standard of living. And if someone has children and these children require care, then it would be very good if an individual had a decent standard of living. I don't think that it's practical. And so the question is, how would one create a system so that individuals who worked at home or cared, caring for the elderly, for example, at home is, in fact, there are federal programs and state programs that pay individuals to care for others at home. The amount that they pay is pretty minimal, but there is still an amount. Whether we had some, basic amount that individuals receive, I don't think that it would be an easy thing to devise appropriately. So I think that there are noble goals, but impractical solutions.
Mm-hmm. One of the solutions that you identify at in the epilogue of your book is a fundamental rethinking of the way the United States handles care, both elder care and child care, burdens that we know fall disproportionately on women. Can you speak to that and any other solutions that you have identified that would move forward?
Some of these are sort of win-win solutions. So let's talk a little bit about universal preschool. So children who are 3 to 5 years old, that would be preschool, pre-kindergarten. They're not, they're out of diapers, so we don't have, some of the larger difficulties. And the question really is, when should school start? In the 1920s, we didn't have kindergarten. There were many states, and in fact, there were countries even recently that didn't start school until 7 years old. Mm. And we know that increases the burdens disproportionately on women, but it also means that children don't get the type of education that will serve them well in their lives. So a win-win solution is when you have a program that that aids both the individuals, such as in this case, the parents, and produces children who are, better in terms of their ability to be good citizens, to earn, and to learn. So I think that's that. So this is a plug for the Biden Universal preschool. Now, the elder care issue is another important aspect. And once again, we do not have a program in the U.S. which is long-term care. We do, Medicaid has a program which is long-term care, but you have to be impoverished. You have to not have wealth to do that. We do not have programs that subsidize long-term care without going into Medicaid. It's not Medicare, but we do have programs that would, in many states, would enable professionals to come into the home and get paid by Medicare to do that. And in places that those exist, what happens, not surprisingly, is that the patient is better off because the patient doesn't have to go elsewhere. And the other person who's better off generally is the daughter, who doesn't come in to take care of of her mother or father. So both of these types of social programs have benefits that go beyond the client. In one case, the little child; in the other case, the sick or elderly person. And those type of social programs are the ones that are being discussed in the White House and in Congress now.
This is another question from the audience. To what extent do you think the increase of women in the workforce is the result of the economy not allowing for single earning households? Has our society begrudgingly come to have more women engaging in work outside of the home because earnings for workers in general have not kept up with inflation?
Yeah, but the sad thing is that would be true of individuals below the median. And we know that, in fact, female labor force participation for lower income households is less than female labor force participation in the higher income households. So it goes slightly the other way.
Can you say a little bit more about that? That's interesting.
Yeah, part of it is because the lower income households have individuals with lower levels of education. And so their ability to get better jobs and to be more sort of motivated to work and to earn income is somewhat less than for the higher income individuals. We have enormously wide inequality of earnings in the US, and we have enormously wide inequality of family income. So at the lower end are disproportionately single moms with kids, okay? And at the higher end are disproportionately couples that have high levels of education. So in fact, I don't buy into the premise of the question, and in fact, the facts don't seem to lend any credibility to it. I think the person who asked it will probably think, no, I can rephrase it so that you understand what I'm saying. And I think that the rephrasing of it would be something like, do women work in general because we have a system in which to be an upstanding family, you have to have incomes that are above some level, and that that's one way of, I think you might be able to interpret what has happened over time. as adding to that, but I would disagree.
Thank you. One thing that is really relevant to this conversation and that you discuss in the book is the difference between institutionalized discrimination, such as marriage bars, and more subtle forms of discrimination, such as women not knowing salaries or women not being advanced. Can you speak about the difference between those formal and informal
Sure.
factors? Thank you.
Yeah. So I think about it in the following way. When there are regulations, you're not even allowed into the club. It's like the door is locked. These regulations can be part of general practice. Women aren't hired in some jobs, let's say. Men aren't hired in other jobs. Or they can be actual regulations such as marriage bars or nepotism bans. But in the other case you mentioned, a person might be invited into the club, but can't partake in all the activities. So the latter are the more subtle factors that prevent women from moving upward and being part of the group. So that's one way of thinking about it.
Thank you. I have another question from the audience. Post-pandemic, how would you like to see employers respond to the many gender dynamic issues that you raised? And what can employers do to fix the problem?
Right. And what employers are doing, for example, is, and this has to do with men and women, they're saying, so think about, for example, in Seattle, it's expensive to live in the heart of Seattle. And so some people, maybe they, took refuge in a cabin somewhere, in the Alpine Lakes region. And
for those who don't know, I will mention that you are an avid hiker, particularly in this part of the world. And so you're quite familiar with many of Washington State's most beautiful areas.
Where I wish I was. And so this is true for men and women, that firms in Seattle, in San Jose, in San Francisco, and Boston, Chicago, all over, are faced with, I would like to work 3 days a week on site and 2 days a week not, and a whole different range. What we want to make certain of, though, is that the group that is working more at home or in the cabin in the Alpine Lakes region, that we don't create a work from home ghetto that's women. We want to make certain that there's more equality. So if there's work from home 2 days a week, we should all be working at home 2 days a week. Now, this creates various problems for the footprint of corporations, of firms, that many firms right now have too much commercial real estate, which is, pretty astounding given, I think if anyone said one of the results of this pandemic would be too much commercial real estate a year and a half ago, I think we would have said, or in March of 2020, we would have said, there's no such thing as too much commercial real estate, but that's what we have. So what firms can do is two things. Number one, take advantage of the fact that we just figured out that you don't have to do a handshake in Tokyo, and make certain that everyone has the ability to do these, what used to be, Pacific and Atlantic flights, that everyone has the ability, the same ability to do these remotely. And just make certain that the clients see eye to eye with you on this. And the second thing is, make certain that if you do have work from home, that it not disadvantage individuals who have children, and in particular women.
We have time for one more question from the audience, so feel free to drop those into the chat box that you can see. But Claudia, I have one other question that I received. You mentioned your dog earlier. Can you tell us about your dog? This is off the topic of your book, but I know is something very dear to your heart.
Certainly. So I love to train, and I love all dogs, and I love to work with them in performance, in obedience, rally. And my dog turned out to be just a great center, and he comes from a great tracking line. And his father lives in Orinda, California. His brother lived, in fact, in right outside of Seattle, and he's just a phenomenal friend. He's a good guy, and he was doing he was doing work in a local nursing home. He was a therapy dog there until March of 2020, when he, like many other Americans, was laid off. And the good news I received today is that they're starting again, and they asked if he could come back.
Oh, congratulations. Look at that labor market rewriting itself. We have an interesting question. Have you looked into the companies that sort of prey on stay-at-home moms, like the Pampered Chef or Avon or Mary Kay, and what implications those have for women in labor? So these multi-layer marketing schemes.
Yeah, this is absolutely amazing. So not being in a business school, this isn't the sort of stuff this isn't the bread and butter stuff, but I happen to have been driving the other day, which is the only time I listened to the radio. And I heard a show on these firms. And I don't know that the show wasn't about any disproportionate preying on men versus women, but it certainly did seem as if it was more, it was disproportionately women who would be preyed upon, because they would be individuals who were at home who thought, oh, I could. This was not, this was a company that was telling people that you could open up a boutique, a clothes boutique in your own home. And if you would only just invest $10,000, you could do that. So this is an thank you for the question. And it's something that I will send to my friends across the river. And if you don't know what Harvard is like, we're in two different cities. So the business school is across the river in Boston, and the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, where I am, is in Cambridge. So when I say shoot a question across the river, I mean send it to my friends at Harvard Business School, because this is really an excellent question about whether some people who are working from home are trying to add something big to their family through these companies that may be they may not be as clear and as profitable as one might have thought. So a Ponzi scheme is what some people call them, right? Although there's one great investor who lost his shirt on claiming that one of them was a Ponzi scheme, right?
We had this just come in. I look at the people, mostly men, at the top of large companies and don't see how these jobs can be done without huge amounts of hours. Do you think it's possible? I think we'd all agree with that. Do you think it's possible for a woman to make it to the top and have kids without a primary caregiver?
Well, if you look at the people at the top, they're generally not 35 years old. That's the other thing. Mm-hmm. Okay, so with the exception of a Mark Zuckerberg, so they're generally older, and I would say that there are some famous examples. The head of Yahoo had twins. Well, I think Yahoo wasn't going to do very well with or without the twins, but I certainly know that there are some jobs that require 24/7, and for a very long time, I would say the president of I do not want the president of my country to be a part-time president. And then we had a period when I felt that I did have a part-time president. And so now we don't have a part-time president anymore. And yes, there are going to be positions that require a tremendous amount of time. And they're going to be moments in your life when you can give it, and moments in your life when you can. But the issue that we're talking about is couple equity rather than individual, when that individual goes out and works the super long hours. So a project that I'm working on now, by the way, is called The Other Side of the Mountain. And that shows that hiking is in my blood. And the notion here is that having a family, raising kids, is climbing up the mountain. It's a lot of work, but it's filled with a tremendous amount of pleasure and joys. And you get to the top of the mountain, and then the question is, when your kids are, in junior high school or middle school or high school, can you then, they're independent people, although some of them can create a certain amount of trouble. Can you race down the other side of the mountain? And to what degree can you sort of catch up to where you thought you wanted to be at that point? And that's what we're looking at now. And the the problem is that with the groups of individuals that we're looking at who were educated in the 1990s, let's say, because we want individuals who are about 50 years old, 55 years old now. We're not finding that women are doing as much racing. They are racing down the other side, but they're not catching up to the guys. So maybe in 20 years, we'll do this again and discover that they are, because in fact, there was greater couple equity.
Well, that's a beautiful transition to my last question for you this evening, which is what's next? What new projects are you excited to take on?
Sure.
And since you've just given us a sneak peek, I'll invite you to expand that in whatever way you want.
So the project that I'm most excited about now is a very historical project. So 78 years ago, America was at war, and it realized that a very large fraction of men had been drafted. The factories of America needed to be needed more labor, and looking for labor all over. The group that was clearly could be employed were young women, and young women often have young children. And so in 1943, America took money from an act that was called the Lanham Act, that was an infrastructure bill. And it took it and it invested in essentially universal preschool. And these were called nurseries, but they were open early in the day, closed late in the day. They had good food, they had nurses, they had education. They were truly preschool. They were not babysitting. And what we're doing is we're trying to figure out who probably went to these places. Now, believe it or not, even though there were several thousand of them, the government never collected information about where they were.
Wow.
Many of them, by the way, were in Seattle, or I should say Seattle had many. New York City had zero. And the reason is that you had to prove to the federal government that you were producing goods for the war and you didn't have enough labor to do it. And so what we're doing is we're looking at newspapers at the time, and we're finding the addresses of where these were. And then we will be able to have, using the most amazing methods, we will be able to take the 1940 census and figure out which individuals were probably affected by these, who were between 3 or 2 and 5 or 6 years old. And then we can actually track them over time to to today, versus individuals who were similar but who didn't have access to these nurseries.
Wow. Well, that sounds absolutely fascinating. So I look forward to maybe meeting you back here in a couple of years to have a conversation about that work once you've had the chance to complete it. Dr. Claudia Goldin, it has been just an absolute joy to speak with you this evening. I'm going to hold up your book, Career and Family. For those who haven't had a chance to read this yet, highly encourage it. I learned a tremendous amount and came away with a lot of ideas, realized that I had some misconceptions, and really expanded my thinking. So Dr. Goldin, it's just been a pleasure to speak with you this evening.
Well, Kiana, the questions that we've been discussing, we discussed some of these before. They are absolutely fascinating. And of course, one never writes the full book. One only writes a little piece.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, on behalf of Town Hall, I want to thank both of you so much for this conversation. It's been so interesting. I feel like I've learned a lot as well, and it gives me a lot to chew on, and I hope that a lot of people feel the same. I want to thank the audience as well. Thank you for watching, and thank you for your questions. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of the book, I encourage you to use the link in the chat. That's going to take you to Third Place Books, so you can support a local store tonight. And I hope that, Claudia, you're able to get out to Seattle sometime soon, maybe, if only to just go for a hike out here. But thank you again for joining us. And thank you so much, Kiana, for your moderation.
And if anyone wants to send me a comment, my email is very easy to get.